The topic for this discussion panel is what do real-life cognitive psychologists actually do in their own classroom? Sure, they talk a great research game, but what do they actually do in their classrooms? So joining us on the panel is David Miele, and he teaches the physiology of learning, psychology of learning. Also joining us is Shana Carpenter. She teaches learning and memory and research methods. Third on the panel is Tanya Martini. She teaches introductory psychology and human learning. And Ido on the end teaches science in our lives. So I'm going to ask our panelists three different questions. The first question is, are students different today compared to previous generations? The second question will be, how has your personal approach to teaching been shaped by research in education and cognition? And finally, what's the biggest mistake that you've made in your own teaching? Throughout this panel, if you have a question that you would like to ask the panelists, please do come up to the front and ask away. I'm going to ask each panelist to give an initial response to the questions. We'll start on the end here with building up performance anxiety here. Why don't we start with David? And Ido, you'll be last. So you can just relax. Okay, so let's look at that very first question then. Are students different today compared to previous generations? David?
How old do you think I am? No, but to answer that, let's see, we were just last night, some of us at dinner were talking about differences in some of the kind of mental health issues that college students kind of are experiencing. And I don't know, that's the one that seems most salient to me from when I started, let's say, teaching, you know, as a graduate student to now. There seems to be, you know, students are coming to me and to my colleagues more often with, you know, issues pertaining to anxiety problems, depression, and sometimes to the point where it's you know, debilitating. They can't show up to class, or there's you know, some kind of, you know, accommodation that needs to be made. And I guess it's not clear to me that it's a generational effect in the sense of that kids nowadays have more of these issues, or that it's more that they're more comfortable voicing them, that there's less stigma around problems with mental health. But I think, you know, to link that back then to kind of their intellectual development and to, you know, their cognitive performance in the class, obviously from what we've heard today, even just talking about how anxiety and other kinds of affective issues can influence just, you know, your attentiveness, the way you process. It's a big issue. I've heard, I think recently, just kind of echoing my own firsthand experience, there was, I heard like a show on National Public Radio in the US where they brought in some people who were studying this and saying, yeah, they consider it to be kind of an epidemic, that they're really, you know, it's not really well understood why it is, you know, whether there are generational kind of historical reasons related to, for example, the financial crisis, you know, that kind of made the parents really focused on, you know, preparing their children for a kind of dire competitive work world, and whether that, you know, there was a certain kind of stress conveyed to kids that, you know, bolstered their sense of concern or danger, or just generally increased their anxiety.
Well, it reminds me of a point that you made last night as well, where you said back in the day, when you and I were students, we could kind of go home and shut everything off. There were no real other comparisons being made, but today when students go home, they go on social media, they go on Facebook, Instagram, whatever the case might be, and they're bombarded with these curated images and perceptions of other people's lives. So there's never a downtime, and I'm wondering, and I guess we were both wondering, how that must impact a person's daily living.
Right. I mean, as I put my social psychology cap on and think about it through the lens of identity and self-concept, right? I mean, I think everybody, you know, to the extent to which you kind of look out at everybody else in the world and say, wow, you know, their lives just seem so much better. and without necessarily realizing that they're all doing exactly the same thing that you're doing, which is to curating the best possible version of themselves and reflecting it outwards to the world. So they get the sense they look at everybody without kind of doing the mental correction that says, oh no, these people are all trying to make their lives seem really good, and they probably, unbeknownst to me, experience some of the same anxieties and concerns. But so there's always this kind of sense that I'm not matching up, I'm not doing as well. And like you said, because it's, social media nowadays, especially for the younger generations, is a 24/7 kind of enterprise. There's never a break from it. I think I can imagine that it can just be really taxing and really stressful.
Shana, your thoughts on this question?
So I love that I'm getting old enough now that I can start a sentence with back when I was younger, when I'm teaching. But the thing that I've noticed the most is probably related is the changes in the way that students communicate with each other. I don't know what they do when they're out of my presence, but with their professors. 11 years I've been teaching at university, and it wasn't that long ago, or it doesn't seem the case, that they had no trouble coming to office hours and talking about their lives and talking about school and classes as well, but they were very comfortable looking me in the face and talking to me, and not every single one of them. But now, the last couple of years, I don't think I've had one student come by without having an appointment scheduled, and only if they're really struggling in a class. I see them on campus, they don't stop, they don't say hi, they have a social phobia almost. And I don't know what, probably several things are driving this, but very, very quick on the trigger with the emails, with the instant messaging, anything electronic, anything not in real time, face to face. So it's not that they're not communicating, they're backing away from the face to face. And I am troubled by that. There's all kinds of things that go with that are, I think, reflective of other things, and that do have effects on their learning. That's probably the biggest thing that I've noticed.
That's interesting. Do you think that there's less social skills, of like skills required to interact with you as a professor?
I had 3 students last year alone who had to get up and leave my office because they were having anxiety attacks over just talking about an exam. And that's never happened before. And I'm making my exams easier, so it's not an objectively more difficult challenge. It's something about maybe some of the personal struggles David mentioned, maybe some of what's engaging them on a daily basis, all the screens and electronics and social skills are exactly that, a skill. If they're not practiced, I think you can see some declines. So I guess so, yeah, it's the social skills are sort of going downhill, I would say.
Yeah, I agree with both of you, because I think if I was, and if you guys are talking about back when I was, be like way back when I first started, the anxiety issues kind of eclipse almost everything else. But I'm thinking, and I don't know if any of you have looked at these data or read the book, but last year on a couple of different occasions, I saw Jean Twenge speak about her work. And I don't know if any of you are familiar with her book, iGen. One of the things that's kind of neat about her work is that she's looking at nationally representative samples in the States, and these are samples that have been going back to sometimes the 60s and 70s. And so she's looking at young adults from different cohorts and looking at them across time. And these are, it's very simple data that she's presenting. She's just looking at frequencies, So she looks at behavioral stuff like, when was the first time you had sex, and when was the first time you started smoking, and how much do you smoke, and when did you get your first job, and when did you get your driver's license. But she also looks at mental health behaviors. and looking at how people get information. So if I was just going to sort of try and take this off on a different track, I mean, she makes a strong case for exactly what you said, which is it's not the screens, it's the social media in particular, and there's evidence to suggest it's problematic, not just in terms of what we see, but in terms of behaviors like cutting and people showing up in the emergency room. But I want to sort of talk about the one graph in her presentation that was so striking to me, because it was a curve that basically just looked like a precipice, and it was how much time do you spend reading? And that's something that I've noticed, and I'm not sure what other people's experience has been. I don't think it's that they're actually actively seeking out less information, but they're not necessarily consuming information in print. And so what I've noticed, and I don't know if this is typical, is that students are really struggling when you give them dense text. They don't have a lot of practice with reading dense text. And I think that's also a skill that doesn't necessarily materialize just because you happen to need it. And I don't think that the kind of reading that they're doing in my class is the same as kind of picking up Twilight on the beach and reading that over the summer holidays. So that's, if I was going to sort of throw out something in addition to anxiety, that's one of the differences that I've noticed in terms of then versus now. But having said that, I do think there are some commonalities. Like they're not a whole different species. And so, you know, when I talk to them about the fact that, like, I was the poster child for a terrible transition to university and failed 2 of my midterms, and sometimes they will come in and talk about it, especially if they are struggling. I look at them and I think, like, some things manifest exactly the same way, cohort after cohort. Like, I look at them and think, you sound just like I felt. It comes across the same way. So I don't want to suggest that they're entirely different. I see some similarities, but there are these kind of notable differences, and I agree with both of you about what you've seen as well.
Yes, I want to build on what Tanya just said about the use of technology. And in my experience, students these days are used to being constantly stimulated by technology. So they might have their smartphone on one hand and a laptop and perhaps another device. And then they come to a classroom where there is not that much stimulation going on, usually, right? And that's kind of a shock for many of them. I feel that that's a big challenge for us as instructors, because in order to keep students engaged, we need to do much more than perhaps what people had to do in the past, right? If instructors in the past were used to just reading out of their lecture notes, that would never fly today, right? No student in the room would stay engaged if that's the case. And that's partially because of how people these days interact with technology and the level of stimulation that they are expecting. So I try to use technology on one hand. I also like to use some more old-fashioned techniques with my students. For instance, I encourage them to take hand notes rather than take notes on a computer, because there is research showing that hand notes are more effective than computer note-taking. But then, you know, obviously, I try to use technology rather than ignore it, and I can talk more about it when we get to teaching strategies and techniques.
Okay, I think that concludes our first question. And as I said, if anyone has a question at any point, please feel free to come up to the microphone. Our second question, which really gets to the heart of the matter, is how has your own personal approach to teaching been shaped by all of this amazing research that we've been talking about at this conference on education and cognition? So let's come right back up to the front of the line with David.
Okay, so I mean, I think there are some things that I do that kind of are in line with some of the cognitive strategies that I think, you know, people like Shana and others have discussed. And so I'm not going to focus too much on those, because I think it's not, you know, I think they could describe the rationale for using those better. I mean, I do just to quickly kind of highlight, I you know, have plenty of quizzes and cumulative exams to take advantage of kind of repeated testing effects. I, you know, kind of attuned to the same kind of research that Ido just talked about with respect to handwritten notes. So, and also I'm concerned about attentional problems, with students distracting each other. So I actually have a no laptop or cell phone policy in my classes, at least with undergraduate students. And what I'll do is I'll either make sure that I post my slides ahead of time with time for them to print them out. And if I'm still fiddling up, on my slides up until the very end, then I'll print them out for them so that they can just kind of make notes on the slides and they don't feel the pressure to kind of handwrite everything that they've, that's on the slides, and they can just focus on writing notes that are really synthesizing they're essentially engaging in generation of, based on the content and not just kind of rote documentation of it. But what I wanted to focus on were some kind of more motivationally relevant strategies that I use in my course. So I gave a different talk on this at a teaching workshop. So I have this slide in front of me, but I kind of based that workshop on self-determination theory, which is the idea that students, the theory is rooted in the idea that all students have certain core psychological needs, a need for kind of belonging or relatedness, a need for competence, and a need for autonomy. And so I kind of categorize some of the things that I do along which of these needs does it primarily serve. So in terms of fostering a sense of relatedness, and I can only do this because I have relatively small classes, but I'll try to meet with every single student separately at the beginning of each semester to try to establish a kind of rapport, even if it's just for 10, 15 minutes, kind of ask them some questions about where they're at in their college career, what they hope to do after school, what they hope to get out of the course. And I find that really just establishing that rapport with them seems to make them that much more comfortable in the class and comfortable kind of asking me questions throughout or coming to my office hours. Although I have also noted that people don't come to office hours much anymore. I think, in terms of, I'm particularly sensitive to the idea of trying to make sure that your more underrepresented students feel a sense of relatedness, because they're, I think, by default, less likely to experience that sense of inclusion or relatedness, regardless of what you're doing. And so, I try to feel those students out who I feel like might come from underrepresented backgrounds during those initial meetings, and just to get a sense of whether they might need, some extra support, or just to really also sometimes, in as a comfortable a way as possible to make them feel like, I understand what some of the challenges might be that you face that other students don't face. And when I've gone out of my way to signal that understanding, I sometimes get a real strong sense of appreciation back, that they really appreciate that I'm not just, that I've thought a little bit about, and I'm attuned a little bit to the kind of unique struggles that a person of color or a low-income student might face, particularly on the BC campus, which is overwhelmingly white and overwhelmingly affluent. And I think more generally for all students, conveying to them that I have a sense of what the demands of college life are, and not just making it seem like, well, there's my course and that's all that matters, and that I have a sense of how much they're being asked to do in all their courses and all the extracurriculars and stresses of modern life. And so I think conveying that also helps to foster a sense of connection to me as the instructor. In terms of fostering perceptions of competence, building off of my lecture from yesterday, I try to use kind of growth-oriented language when I'm discussing, performance and the development of skills within my course as much as I remember to. I very much, as I think a lot of us do, use kind of more criterion referenced grading. So, I'm very much against the idea of kind of normative grading schemes like curved grading, like they do in certain disciplines, because we even have some data in our own lab that suggests that can really undermine students' sense of efficacy, make them more performance-oriented, and even potentially kind of shift them into more of a fixed mindset. In terms of fostering a sense of autonomy, a sense of personal agency, I like to administer a mid-semester course evaluation independently of the final course evaluation that they get, where I ask all the same questions that are on the final evaluation, but I add some of my own questions. And then what I do with it, I actually incentivize that they all complete it by giving them a little extra credit for it. So I usually get almost, I get like 90% completion rate. And then I go through it, and then I just, allocate 10, 15 minutes at the beginning of one of the classes to just go over what I see some of the themes to be and discuss, either what, changes I'm going to make or why I think I can't necessarily address those concerns, because maybe there's enough people that fall on both sides of the issue. Some people want more lectures, some people want more group work. I can't kind of make everybody happy. But I find just by, I don't have any data for this, but I do have the sense that just by, allowing them to provide, feedback in an anonymous, safe way, and then making them feel heard, right? That gives them a sense of agency. That gives them a sense that there's somebody here who's responsive to, their concerns, their needs, and that makes them feel more agentic. I think, just provision of choice, giving them, if you have a class project, giving them, a choice of topics or choice of, I had them do a class project where they have to do a set of learning observations, so giving them a sense of choice in terms of where they want to do that, building a certain amount of choice within a kind of structure that makes the assignment manageable, I think also fosters a sense of agency. And then I think the last thing that I'll say, which is actually rooted in some interventions that are gaining a lot of attention in the educational psychology literature at the moment, is the idea of kind of trying to help students connect, the material that they're learning to things that are to personally relevant interests, right? So in the motivation literature, there are these things called utility value interventions or sometimes relevance interventions, and they're really simple. It's really just a matter of sometimes just having students, take, 10, 15 minutes towards the beginning of the semester, sometimes longer, to kind of write about why they think what they're going to be learning about in class or what they're currently learning about will be personally relevant for them in terms of their long-term goals, in terms of their values that extend beyond the class. People are exploring now with new and better ways to do it instead of just having these open-ended writing prompts. Sometimes what they'll do is to have people, they'll take quotes from other students that speak to all different reasons why this content might be interesting or important, and they'll present them to the students, and then they'll say, okay, rank order these, right? Which of these are most aligned with your reasons for being here? And that can be useful because sometimes students, if you give them a blank page, they just have trouble kind of coming up with things on their own. So, but in any case, these interventions have often been found to be effective. I think there's some inconsistency, like with the mindset research, but like with the mindset research, they tend to be particularly effective for certain groups of students, particularly for underrepresented students who come from backgrounds where it might not be as obvious why, how the biology class that they're taking might be personally useful for their long-term goals. It helps to strengthen their interest and in some cases strengthen their achievement, their grades, and so forth. So
I can see the connections from like the themes that you raised in your talk last night.
Yeah.
Just a quick question, is this, I would call like an empathetic approach, something that you've done all along, or is it something that you've kind of grown into as you've matured as a teacher?
I think that just out of the need sometimes to kind of foster a deeper sense of engagement, just when I'm teaching particularly abstract stuff, and sometimes I'm aware that maybe I'm talking at too high a level or in ways that where they seem to be kind of, glazing over. There's this like, okay, well, what can I do? I still want to teach the content with the same rigor. I still want them to be able to understand it at the same level of depth or abstraction. Well, maybe I can just take, I can do a little self-reflection exercise for 5 minutes even, where just write about, try to think of some personal examples from your previous experience where you observed this phenomenon, or you observed it in somebody that's close to you, or just write about why you think it's personally meaningful. And that's something that I've progressively tried to do more. Let's move on to Shana.
So the evidence-based stuff that I tend to focus on in my teaching is the learning principles and the cognitive, how to improve what students can learn and retain and use over time. And we've heard some stuff about this at this conference, spacing and retrieval practice. These are things, someone else said this, maybe a couple people have mentioned that when students enter school, even from a very young age, they're taught lots of content, but they're not taught how to learn stuff. It's just assumed if this is given to you and you have to know it, you're going to do something to learn it. But so many things we know about increasing the efficiency and the effectiveness of learning. Part of my job, I see it as, is to make sure to communicate these things to students. It's a class on memory, and how to improve your memory is a big part of memory and how to improve learning. So we have a section. It's funny, I used to do this a little more midway through the semester about study skills and learning strategies and very concrete, specific things that they can do that will double their ability to retain information and use it. And then at the end of the semester, they got so upset that I didn't do that at the beginning of the course because they could have used it. So someone had said that earlier today. So I changed that part, and we now do the learning principles, study strategies at the beginning, and as concrete as possible from the literature. They want to know, well, how many times do I have to retrieve it? When should I retrieve it? How often? And there are some specific, it's not cookie cutter clean, but there are some specific answers to those questions that do work. And so I come up with just sort of a little guide that I give to them, and we talk about the research, and some adopt it and love it, and they're almost like converts, and then they want to go get everybody else on board, and that's wonderful. Others are interested a little, and then it kind of peters out, and I don't know what the others do, but some really take to it. They really like these things. They use them. I've got enough data now from classes over the years. This is all just what the students tell me. They've done this, they've done this, they've done that, and I know the scores they get on the exams and everything else for the course. So I've started to also show the next semester students, after we have our little workshop on here's what works, try to do it. These are the grades in the class of the students who did do these things. And the right incentive, if you want to get a B+ or higher, these are some good things that you can do. And I think that's been good from what they tell me. They really like hearing about, they don't have to go out and read all these journal articles, but here's a very synthesized, specific plan that they can follow, that they see is working, and it goes well. They know that it's up to them to do these things. It's not just going to magically happen.
So Shana, if we focus on, let's think about that group of students who seems to be convinced by the data, but they don't necessarily implement the changes. How can we reach them? What is the next step to convince someone to actually adopt the change, someone who believes the data?
They have to have the right circumstances, and sometimes doing poorly on an exam and then feeling that need to fix it is the only thing that makes it happen. So you can lead them to the water. You can show them the data, show them everything prior to the exam. But I do think that the act of doing these things is a good reality check for how well they know the stuff, which sort of circumvents the need for the reality check to be the exam, which is where you really run into trouble with consequences. Those who buy it and believe, yeah, this is probably helpful, but don't do it. Why they don't do it, the reasons are usually they don't have time. So I don't have time to space out my study. I've kicked that one by telling them, I show them a graph. I made a new graph where I've converted all the data into time. So if you, I can share it if folks want it. It's really good little visual. Instead of looking at how many times you have to study something and when and what score that translates to, so like we graph on all of our graphs, you get 80% if you studied this 3 times at this schedule, you get 70% if you studied it 3 times at a different schedule. How much time does it take to do that studying if your goal is an 85? So it's a slightly different way of visualizing the data, but a lot of students, they don't go into an exam thinking, oh, I'm going to do this and this and this and that, and then whatever I get. No, they think, oh, I want about an 85, I want a 90. They have like something in mind that they want. So it translates into, you want an 85, you want to spend as little time as possible studying, here's what you need to do. And the time, presenting it to them that way has seemed like it's gotten more of them on board, at least from what they tell me. I don't actually go home with them and monitor if they're doing these things, but I believe them. So that's a good, finding the right pitch, finding the right thing that motivates them that they want by doing these things. And I think there's something we just have to find.
Can I ask a question with that?
Yeah.
Do you think that it's always an issue of motivation, or also it's an issue of habit? It's particularly with spacing. Sometimes I think, it's not as simple sometimes as just, instituting a strategy at no cost. It's about like the stress of trying to, act in a more conscious and deliberate way when it's so much easier to go on autopilot. So it's not just time. Yes, the time is the same or even less, but you have to overcome, your natural proclivity.
I think if you asked a student, would you rather look at your material and study it a month before the exam, or let me poke you in the eye really hard right now? They would rather be poked in the eye than do that. There's something about studying when you don't feel that urgent, imminent pressure that's very hard to do. I was a huge procrastinator as a student. If I don't have to do something, it's very, very hard to get me to do it. But that's where, so it helps if you give them kind of a concrete, like a schedule. I'm the teacher, so I know the content. So I tell them the exam's coming up in 5 weeks. This is the stuff you need to focus on this Tuesday, next Thursday, following Friday. Here's a study schedule. Here's the practice questions posted online that go with those. So that's helped kind of make the tools easy to access. And they ultimately have to access them, and they have to use the brain and do the mental work. But the more effort we can take out of the actual setting it up and getting ready to use it part, I think helps. Doesn't get them all.
So if I could just share a story. So in my introductory psychology class, I have a unit that's called the science of learning. And when I used to do it right before the midterm, people say, oh, why don't you just do this at the beginning of the class? Because then we would know. And then what I found is that, no, people actually have to fail. They have to struggle, and then they're much more receptive to this message of what they learned in the science of learning. And then I find that most people seem to be convinced, like, yeah, I believe that space retrieval practice will work. And they're nodding their heads, but they still won't drink the water. So the next step that I do is I say, okay, we have a midterm this Friday. Everyone, open your computers and get your calendars out right now. I want you to estimate how much time you can realistically devote to preparing for this midterm. It could be any number. It could be 6 hours, it could be 10 hours. It'll vary from individual to individual. Now divide that by 3. And look into your calendar and find 3 spaces that fill that time block. Put this into your calendar right now. What many students come up to me afterwards and say is that, I know it sounds silly, but if you didn't make us do that right now in class, I would never have actually done this. And now I think I might try it for my other courses. So that's my own personal experience. Let's move on to Tanya.
So I don't have enough time to give you all the mistakes that I made when we do the next pass. So I'm going to start talking about my mistakes right now. And I'll just tell you about 2. Like, reading about cognitive load changed my whole perspective on what it meant to stand up in front of a class. And so one of the things that I feel like I do much better now that I was truly, truly awful about is just thinking a lot more about how cognitive load factors into the context of a lecture. It factors into how much material I'm prepared to present. And reading Rich Mayer's stuff about how cognitive load plays out in the multimedia sphere and what it means in terms of designing PowerPoint slides, I think that really was a game changer for me. So that's one kind of piece of the cognitive literature that I've really tried to embrace and bring into my teaching. The other one, and apologies to those of you who are in my workshop because I've already talked about this, is the literature on transfer, which is getting right to your point about relevance. I teach 1,500 students, about 200 of them are psychology majors. They often will look at the empirical paper that I ask them to write in intro psych, and I think for the vast majority of them, they cannot see how this will connect to, I'm a historian, I want to be an archivist, I want to be a cop, I want to be a social worker. I'm never going to have to write a paper like that. And so I've spent some time digging around in the literature on transfer, and we know that, I think I knew that transfer was hard. I just didn't really think about how does that matter when you're talking about a classroom and trying to...
Sorry, for those who might not be aware, could you define what transfer means?
Sure, yeah. So what I'm talking about when I'm talking about transfer, a lot of the literature on transfer was really about transfer of knowledge. So how do you take what you know about something and apply it in a situation that's completely novel? And so a lot of people looked at problem solving, and generally what they found is that transfer is a little easier when you've got a lot of expertise because you can kind of see the fundamentals of problems. But what I'm really interested in is transfer of skills. So we talk a lot about transferable skills, and we talk about that as being one of our primary goals in post-secondary education. And I actually think that we talk a good game about transferable skills, but what we know from the literature in cognition is that transfer is hard. And I don't think that the transfer of skills is any easier than the transfer of knowledge. And so when students are sitting in my classroom and I'm asking them to write an empirical paper with an introduction and a method and a results and a discussion section, they look at it and they think, I am never going to have to write anything that looks like this. I really can't see the point. And so one of the other things that I've really tried to do better is to help students to see transfer. And part of that is about helping them to sort of see beyond the surface structure of these assignments and the kinds of skills that I'm trying to build, and help them to see how, there are some fundamentals of, say, written communication that are the same, and it doesn't really matter whether you're writing this empirical paper or you're writing a report for a supervisor or you're writing an email. There are some fundamental things that are exactly the same. So let me talk to you about what they are, and let's talk about how they play out if you want to be a cop or a social worker or design a social media platform. So the literature on cognitive load and the literature on transfer, for me, have been really helpful in terms of guiding changes in the way that I do things in the classroom.
Thank you. And you teach a course called Science in Our Lives, which sounds like a really fascinating course to take and teach. So I'm really curious to hear how you apply evidence to your teaching in that course.
Sure. Yeah. So a word of background about this course. So it's a liberal arts course. It's a science course for non-science majors. So the goal of the course is to introduce students to the field of science and scientific research, and do that in a more accessible, friendly way than how science might be taught elsewhere. And it's a small course. I have about 30 students, so clearly I have more flexibility than in very large courses. I'll briefly touch upon three principles that I try to implement in my teaching. One that we've all heard about a lot throughout this conference is the testing effect or active retrieval. In my course, there are no tests, so no midterm, no final, no weekly quizzes, but I still wanted my students to have enough opportunities to actively retrieve information. So one thing that my colleagues and I introduced is something that we call a weekly reflection, where students at the end of the week need to reflect on what they've learned, make some connections between material to their day-to-day life, and they post that on the course website. And we encourage them to do that without looking at their notes. So they need to actively retrieve information that was taught throughout that week. Another principle that I'm sure many of you have heard of is dual coding, where the idea is that by integrating text and images, we can reinforce learning. And I try to do that using Snapchat. How many people here use Snapchat, the popular messaging app, where you can upload a picture and then add some text? So that's basically dual coding. And students use Snapchat all the time without realizing that that's what they're doing. And obviously they usually don't do that for academic purposes, but I make them do that as part of the course. So they take images of perhaps an experiment or a demonstration that we're doing in class, and then they need to add text to describe what they're doing, and they again put it on the course website and perhaps comment on each other's work. I also encourage them to make either drawing or even comics and then annotate it. So rather than just being exposed to existing images, they can also create their own images. So if they participate in a lab, I would ask them to draw out the experimental setup and label it. Or if we learn about the topic, I might ask them to turn that into a mini comic book, and again, encourage them to think not just verbally, but also using images. And perhaps the third point is on feedback and evaluation. So in addition to me giving feedback to students, I encourage them to give feedback to one another. So at the end of the course, they work on mini research projects, similar to the Brainwaves program that I mentioned earlier today in my talk. And then we have a small poster session where they present their work, and they don't just present their own work, they also walk around the room and give feedback to one another on mini post-it notes, and that proved to be useful. So they get to practice peer review in a mini scale by giving each other feedback. Also with these weekly reflections that they post on the course website, so they are expected not just to post their own reflections, but also to comment on other students' reflections, perhaps comment on what they can identify with, follow up with some additional ideas and so on. And I also try to use self-assessment. So at the end of the course, students create a Pecha Kucha style presentation. So a Pecha Kucha is this format where you prepare 20 slides and you get only 20 seconds to present each slide. So it's very compact and brief. But nonetheless, I feel that's a good skill to have as a student. And moreover, as part of their Pecha Kucha presentation, they need to grade themselves. So they need to give themselves a grade. And I'm telling them that I'm going to take that into account, but they need to provide enough evidence why they gave themselves that grade. And so they need to justify that. So I try to use not just instructor-based feedback, but also peer feedback and self-assessment all combined.
That sounds like a really fascinating course. Wish I could take it. Okay, we're going to move on to our last question. I think the easiest thing to do would be for an instructor to just teach the same old course year after year and just assume some people are going to learn and some people are not going to learn. And I think the sign of an engaged instructor is one who takes some pedagogical risks and probably accumulates a lot of mistakes along the way. And what I'm going to ask our panelists to do is restrict themselves to their favorite or their biggest mistake that they have made in their own teaching. So we'll start off with David.
So I think the mistake that I keep coming back to, it's like something I constantly battle, and it's, I think, not related to what Tanya was saying, is trying to pack too much content into my lectures or class sessions. And I realized that the mistake isn't just that. The mistake is like, you know, as professors, as teachers, as instructors, we need to constantly be kind of like self-assessing and interrogating our own personal hang-ups, you know, and mental blocks, you know. And so for me, you know, it was very much always like, it was something deeply affective. Like I have this, you know, perfectionist quality sometimes in a lot of things that I do, and it was this sense of like, no, there's a certain amount of content that I want to cover, and I gotta get to it. And you know, it's kind of being able to kind of take a step back, right, and say, well, why do I need to get to it? Like, do I really need to get to all of it?
And just a note, each of the presenters at this conference made last-minute, imperceptible changes to their slides that they thought would be critical.
And so I think, you know, for the psychology of learning course that I started teaching at Boston College 6 years ago and taught almost every year, multiple times, you know, I'm still taking stuff out. You know, it's like this progressive, like there was so much in there, and almost every time I come back to the course, I'm like, you know, this would really work a lot better if they just had more time to kind of breathe and kind of really deeply kind of engage in this one set of concepts that I'm trying to cover without having to worry about packing all this other stuff in. So sometimes it's a matter of taking out entire topics and just spreading another unit out over multiple lectures. Sometimes it's just like pulling, you know, 10 slides out of a particular lecture so that I don't feel like I need to kind of race through. And then also just being okay, you know, when I look at the clock and there's only 10 minutes left with just not getting to it, you know, and just saying, you know what, I'm just not going to cover it. It's unlikely that I'll cover it next week. I'm not going to put myself in a hole by getting so backed up. And so I'm fine with that, and I'll just, you know, take those questions, you know, off of the exam, and you know, that's what this course is going to be this semester. So
a related example, when I first was teaching introductory psychology, we were talking about neuroscience. Believe it or not, when I was first teaching, they were even learning about LTP. And then I thought, do first-year students really need to know about long-term potentiation, like neural mechanisms of how synapses connect with each other? And then I happily cut that, and I found that sort of a less is more approach leads to overall better quality of learning, I think.
And I think you can ask the same question you can ask about content, like, do I really need to teach this? You can also ask about ways of teaching, which you might not have ever examined, like, I just assume that this is the way you teach this kind of thing. This is the way you structure your exams. This is the way, you know, you structure a course session. If you periodically, you know, just tell yourself that everything's fair game, right, and just ask yourself, okay, that's an assumption I have maybe from the time that I was undergraduate, and just assume that this is the way college courses need to work, you know, then sometimes you say, yeah, no, I'm comfortable with this way of doing things that I've always done, but sometimes you're like, yeah, this is just a kind of vestige of like how I learned to do things, and you know, there's lots of other alternatives out there that I might not have considered, and I really need to be more open-minded about that.
Well, he took mine, so I have to come up with a different one. The content, yeah, that's a good one. If you have 500 things you're going to teach, and well, I'll tell you, I study forgetting, and they're just going to forget all of it anyway, is the punchline. So if you teach them 500 things and they remember 1% of it a year later, or if you teach them 50 things and they remember 80% because it was more meaningful and in-depth. I didn't do the math to see which one of those is higher, but the second one is supposed to be higher, just kind of on the fly. But okay. I have a good one. Which relates a little bit to what you said for question 2, which is the social, affective, experiential part of teaching and learning is something I didn't really think about for a long time. As a learning expert, I was kind of fixated on content and what are the objective ways to learn something, and you follow these rules, and if you do it this way, you'll be successful, which is true. But to not work equally hard on the atmosphere of encouragement and acceptance and doing things that set an atmosphere of engagement, just in the way that you interact with students and how you mentioned the language that you use with students, the patience, the encouragement, talking to them outside of class, meeting individually with them. I wondered for years why my little group work projects were not more fun for students. And I'd put them in groups, and you talk about this, and you guys talk about that, and then we'll come together and we'll talk, and look how excited I am. You should be excited too. And one really simple thing, I'll just tell you that it's not my idea. I don't know where I got it from, so I can't credit the source if I saw this at a conference or whatever. But doing little simple things like, I now give the students, this is not a huge class, it's about 90 students compared to 1,200. That's nothing. So it's manageable. You can put them in groups of 5 or so to discuss things. They do a survey online at the beginning of the semester with these dorky questions like, are you a cat person or a dog person? Do you have any exotic pets? What's the food that you refuse to eat as a child? Favorite superhero? I don't know, all these things. And then that's how they get assigned to groups. So the Spider-Man fans go over here, and they remember all these, of course. They're very meaningful to them. There's always, so broccoli and tomato soup, if you ever decide to do this, are like two most popular foods that people hated as kids. So you take the broccoli people over here, the tomato soup people, and that's their group. And of course, you're going to talk about class stuff. You're not going to talk about tomato soup for an hour, but it gets them talking like I never anticipated. They instantly have a connection. They're not a stranger anymore. Oh, I hate tomato soup. You hated tomato soup. Let me tell you my tomato soup story. And they just there's no hesitation. They instantly start talking. And then, of course, we got to get into at some point the questions I have here on the screen that I want you to discuss. But just the warm-up and the, oh, I'm comfortable with you now effect is huge. And then they've made a friend for life, and Yeah, and they never shut up after that. I can't get them to stop talking. So that's not a cognitive principle. That's a motivational feeling accepted, and what I say is okay. And I want to talk more about this. And so I never thought about that for the longest time. And I think to overlook that is a big mistake in teaching. I think that's huge.
Okay. I'd be interested in meeting up with the people who love tomato soup right here after the call. Let's move on to Tanya.
So the other biggest mistake that I made was thinking that my teaching evaluations in the early years were an excellent representation of how well I was doing in the classroom. And it actually took me a little bit of time to realize that while they have their place and they can certainly be useful, I was not in any way looking for feedback that would help me in meaningful ways. So, my teaching evaluations were always reasonably good, and I think I just sort of patted myself on the back those first few years without realizing until certain problems started to emerge or, key comments would crop up, you start to realize that feedback is really, really important, and some feedback is better and more valuable than others. So for me, I think one of the biggest mistakes that I made in the early part of my career was not relying on feedback that probably wasn't as helpful or diagnostic as what I look for now and what kinds of questions I ask now.
So I think that one of my big mistakes was to assume that students would read the textbook before class. That doesn't happen. And the reason that I assumed that would happen is that I read the textbook as a student, but I had a really, non-traditional college experience. I studied at the Open University in Israel. Are people familiar with the Open University? It's a British model. Not sure if it exists in Canada, but it's really based on self-learning. So you get all the textbooks at the beginning of the semester. There are classes, but you don't have to go. You submit assignments, you take the test, and that's it, basically. In fact, when I started grad school, that was my first time attending university lectures, which was a very odd experience at first, and I kept looking for the textbook, but sometimes I couldn't find it. So when I started teaching, I assumed that students just read the textbook, and they don't. And unless you find, creative ways to encourage them to do so So then I started introducing weekly assessments at the beginning of each class and students get extra credit if they do well. And these assessments are based on reading as well as reviewing material that was taught previously. So it encouraged them to actively retrieve information and do the reading before class. But that was definitely a mistake that I made at the beginning of the road.
Okay, I want to thank all of our panelists for your candid responses. I find them very enlightening. So thank you very much.